Hi, everyone. It's Margaret Manning here with lifeafterdeath.com. Lifeafterdeath.com is a community of people who are interested in the topic of life after death, near-death experience, reincarnation, and topics related to that theme. Now, we ask questions and talk to experts on themes related to this understanding of life after death, and also our fear of death and how we can actually, use our intelligence and our understanding to live life fully in the present world. And my guest today is Philip Almond. Now, Philip is a retired professor of the history of religious thought at the University of Queensland, and he has written several books on this topic, including the Afterlife, the history of life after death, and also two very interesting ones. There's The Devil, a new biography, and God, a new biography. So he has spent his life looking at religions and religious thought, and I'm so happy to welcome you here today. Hi, Philip.
Hi, Margaret.
You know, I'm looking at all the titles of your books and just your background on this topic, and I'm so happy to ask you some questions about life after death.
Cool. Good.
Well, the thing is, we talk about it. In a previous interview, we looked at the history of how our thinking has evolved. But let's just bring it to the individual level and on a very personal level. Why do you think that as human beings, we have this need to believe in some kind of life after our death?
Well, I think in an anthropological sense, or even in a philosophical sense, I suppose, it really goes to some sense of our understanding of ourselves as human beings. We're probably the species that is distinct from all others by virtue of the fact that we have a consciousness of self and we can reflect on ourselves. And ourselves are made up of our continual memories, as it were. We are nothing but our continual memories. It's really hard to accept that this consciousness will suddenly, like a candle in the night, just be extinguished. So I think there is, as part of who we are as a species, there is this strong sense that this can't just fizzle away. I think the other end of that too is that there's a genuine fear of our just fizzing away like a candle in the night. There's a strong need in our consciousness to continue on. So that's at the core of it. I think the other thing too, perhaps, is that at the end of the day, we're relational beings, and certainly, within the history of Christian thought about the afterlife, even though for the vast majority of the time it's been oriented towards the vision of God, there's always been a tradition that in the afterlife we would link up with people that we've known in this life. So that in some sense the afterlife, I think, is motivated by a desire not to lose those relationships that we have in this life with people. And therefore there develops the hope that these relationships, which is in some sense, at the core of our humanity, that these relationships won't just disappear, that they will continue on.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about what you're saying here is that, it's almost like, as human beings, we're thinking and we're emotional beings. We've got two sides to us. Like the thinking side, we need purpose and we need things to do and to create and to make. And I'm really happy that you mentioned the emotional side too, though, because that's where, like you said, when we lose someone that we've built these patterns with, we've loved them, we've had that emotional connection. When they go, it's like, you've got to kind of have something to hold on to. So it's that rest, that rest in peace is like, yes, but I will see you soon. You often see that when people write about, memorialize someone.
Yes, and that strong sense, one of the classic epitaphs is "We'll meet again."
Yes, yeah.
We'll meet again. That's at the core of belief in the afterlife. That sense of reunion with friends and families and loved ones. As I say, that's been there as a minor tradition within the history of Western thought about the afterlife, predominantly oriented towards the vision of God. But from about the middle of the 19th century, we can say that the modern notion of the afterlife developed. And the modern notion of the afterlife is almost like a secular one, which people hold still who may not have a religious belief. And it's not so much about God, it's about a continuation of this life on the other side. It's about reunion with friends and family And dare I say, from about the same time, it became about reunion with our pets as well. So there is that that we'll be reunited with our favourite animals.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. I was thinking. So go ahead.
No, it's become a social space.
Yes,
social
another
space.
Social network.
Yeah.
No, but the thing that you mentioned that is so powerful is that in previous cultures, maybe it was just when you were born, you were born into a family of whatever, and you knew what you were doing. You were going to be if you were a farmer, you were going to be a farmer. If you were something else, you knew your purpose. But now we are creating our purpose based on relationships, on things we've created. So it's almost like we need it now more than ever. This kind of belief in the afterlife, to give purpose to our lives.
Yes, I think that's true. And what's key to the modern heaven is it has not only to do with purpose in this life, but the modern afterlife is purposeful. The traditional notion of the afterlife was that we fall off the twig at a certain time, and then we would basically just be in the heavenly realm. We would be. But the modern notion of the afterlife includes notions of development. So we won't be static in the afterlife. We won't just be sitting around watching cherubims and seraphims casting their crowns upon the glassy sea, but it will be social and it will be active. It'll be kind of like a glorified Club Med, a Club Med without young people.
Wait, no, okay. So stay with this for a second, because this is really fascinating, and I'm actually really intrigued by it, because I think that when I've spoken to other people on this subject, they often say that this is learning, that when we go into this next life, it's because we have this mission in the cosmic scheme of things over many, many lifetimes to learn, and that we eventually kind of graduate somewhere in the future when we're enlightened. And that seems that what you said, that learning continues after death. Now,
yes.
If there's only one God and there's only one divine energy, it seems that we're constructing our view of heaven as we go. And why is God not trying to achieve some kind of consistency? It's almost like you're saying we do it, like we're creating our story about heaven, regardless of what it really is.
Well,
if that makes any sense. Not that we know what it really is, but
well, in some senses that's true, because if we just say, well, we could say something like, there is this transcendent realm about which we don't really know a great deal, but we'll be in touch with it after death in one way or another. So that's the sort of the minimalist notion. And I suppose the history of the afterlife in any culture is really the history of our imaginings of what that will be. Cultures fill in the details of that possible transcendent realm.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, therefore, as the notion of the companionate marriage developed in the 19th century, as the notion that children were crucial to the well-being of men and women and so on. So we transplanted the kind of ideal human family life here onto the other realm. So there are intimate connections, therefore, between what's happening in particular social contexts at any particular time and the way in which we continue to construct the afterlife. But the key point is the one that you've just raised, that the modern heaven is very much a one in which we develop. And since really about the year 1800, and this is primarily as a consequence of the ideas of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, it's also been a place where we not only change, but where we ethically improve. We actually continue to perfect ourselves as ethical, moral beings.
That is really, truly fascinating. And I'm thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about my mother, because I was thinking that she didn't have a computer. She didn't have a cell phone. She didn't know anything about what we are taking for granted. Here we are talking to each other. You're in Queensland, Australia. I'm sitting in Switzerland. Anyway, the point being that her view of the world was smaller. So so her view of heaven, not that I ever really spoke to her about that now that I think about it, but was obviously smaller than today. Our mind is bigger not mind, but our the stimulus that we pull from is a bit greater. So maybe that's it. What's for the future, do you think, Philip? What heaven do we create next?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, in some senses, there are two visions of the afterlife. There's one vision of the afterlife as something that happens immediately after death, but there's another long-standing tradition of the afterlife as something that will happen at the end of the world. So along that trajectory, the long tradition that sometime down the line, we will be in a perfect utopian world. But this world, now flawed with evil, will return to its original state, as it was, the Garden of Eden. It is paradise after all.
Yeah.
And it's supposed, heaven is supposed to be like things were when the world originally began in the Garden of Eden. So there's that other strong tradition within the West that the afterlife will also be like a perfect world restored, and in some cases it will be this very world restored. Because people will rise up from the dead, they'll be reunited with their souls, and then they will continue to live this earth in a paradisal state. So the other image about the perfect world to come back is running alongside a kind of alternative world envisaged as something that exists immediately after death. Messy in there.
No, this is really interesting because in a way you're actually bringing together the Eastern and the Western, because in the Western you're saying that people go to this heaven where they just kind of wait until the end of time and then they're resurrected in their body. And Eastern traditions are saying, well, we're not going to hang around in a heaven just doing nothing. We'll just keep coming back in another body, getting better and better to contribute to this better world. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And interestingly, in some senses, the West has caught up with the East, because the Eastern is about continual life, rebirth, and continual moral improvement until we get to the point where we can escape the cycle of samsara. But the West is now more seeing the afterlife as something in which we grow, in which we develop, in which human relationships can continue, and so on. So in that sense, the West and the East are coming together with the notion that the afterlife is about ethical development and human growth.
Well, this is hopeful. World peace might become a possibility.
Yes.
No, but
not on another.
No, I think that's really, really fascinating. And actually, when you think about the traditions, the Tibetan tradition, for example, where the Tibetan Book of the Dead, guides you through all the stages, and then you have kind of a personal experience of heaven until you join the cosmic. And then the Eastern side is saying the same thing. You go to heaven and you wait. Well, you meet your friends, though. You do meet people. It's not like solitary. There's a big difference there, isn't there? That the Eastern journey seems to be more individual.
Yes, it depends on the Eastern tradition in a way. I mean, in some
so many,
it's about the liberation of the individual soul. In the Buddhist tradition, it's more about nirvana and not extinction of the soul, but the end of individual suffering, at least. In the Indian tradition, or like the Vedanta tradition, it's the absorption of the soul into the universal soul. Mm-hmm. It's absorbed into Brahman, the Godhead. So there are traditions within both the Christian and the Indian traditions which see us at the end of the day rather like drops of water absorbed into the ocean of God. That's there in the West and it is in the East. So both have a tradition of individual consciousness.
And we haven't even talked about Judaism and Islam and Zoroastrianism. There's so many other threads that have different views of paradise and what happens when you die. But I think what's interesting is that what we've talked about here is that there's some evolution of how we think about life after death in all traditions. Or maybe would you say that, or you think some are remaining constant, like Islam, for example, or Judaism?
Yes, it's really hard to talk to generally there. I mean, Islam has in some ways followed the tradition of Western views of the afterlife in the sense that Islam is still predominantly has a doctrine of the afterlife, which is about what happens at the end of the world rather than what happens immediately after death. Mm-hmm. There are variations on that too. Islam has the doctrine of the soul spending eternity united with God, just as the Christian mystical tradition does. And so too Judaism, primarily focused on what happens to individuals when the end of the world comes, but Judaism too absorbs Greek philosophy, absorbs the doctrine of the soul, and ends up with, a mystical tradition which sees spiritual life as the return of the soul to the God or the Godhead out of which it originally came. So a lot of the traditions are following the same kinds of pathways, or they have the same variety of views.
We have taken a journey here, like way beyond the original question, but it really does come back to it, which is regardless of the culture, regardless of the religion, there is this desire for meaning in our lives and a belief in afterlife, a belief in something more than this earth existence
and I think, present. Yes, and I think what drives thoughts about the afterlife is the quest for meaning, and that life is rendered disturbed if this is where it ends.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all your research you've done on this. We're going to talk in another video about some of the books you've written on the biography of the devil and the biography of God, and also a new book you're working on, which is very, very exciting. So we'll talk about that later. But thank you so much, Philip, for your time. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our Life After Death YouTube channel and visit our website at lifeafterdeath.com. We are a community of people who are fascinated by the topic of life after death and subjects like near-death experience, the afterlife, reincarnation, and spirituality. Together we are exploring and discovering these topics together with curiosity and an open heart.